Hey, this is Boaz. Thanks for showing up. Please visit the Fools and Sages podcast at foolsandsagespodcast.com. There are no spaces and it's all spelled out. You can find show notes, references, bios, merch, and other cool features. Contact us if you have feedback or a question, if you want to appear on the show, or if you want either or both of us to be a guest on your podcast. You can listen and subscribe on Spotify, YouTube, Rumble, Apple Podcasts, iHeart Podcasts, and anywhere else great podcasts are found. And follow us on X and Instagram. Support us on Patreon. The Patreon link's also in our website. And thank you. Enjoy the show. Hi, welcome to the Fools and Sages podcast, where we fools attempt to bring ideas from philosophy and psychology to people, hopefully to give you practical ways to build them into your day-to-day life. I'm Boaz. I've been a founder and executive in renewable energy for the last 25 years or so, and now I work with organizations as a consultant, mostly on transformation.
Hey, folks. Welcome back to the Fools and Sages podcast, or welcome to new time first listeners. I'm Brian. I'm a teacher and a builder and a artist and a therapist and a backyard philosopher.
Cool. Thanks, Brian. So you have mentioned Federico Faggin a few times to me on this podcast. And so I had to go and check him out. And I listened to an interview he did with Andre Ducom. So shout out to Andre Ducom. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And I really enjoyed it. And there were a couple of ideas in there that I thought it would be interesting to kick around. And interestingly, it's kind of not the big ideas. The big ideas, I think we've actually covered in some way, although maybe they'll come up. But there were a couple of smaller ideas that I thought would be interesting, and I'll throw them both out there, and maybe we can take whichever one has energy for us first, and then come back to the other, and we'll kind of see what happens.
Sounds good.
So one idea that Faggin talked about on this podcast was kind of answering the question of how do we start becoming aware that that we are vessels of consciousness. And his answer to that was responsibility, that taking responsibility is crucial. And the example he gave was in some interpersonal conflict, he recognized that he was attached to being right. And when he let go of being attached to being right and took responsibility for his part in the interpersonal conflict, which apparently was he defaulted to turning the other cheek. And what he decided to do instead was to stand up for his boundaries, I guess.
Okay.
He didn't spell out, the exact circumstances.
Right.
But he kind of talks about taking responsibility even at that level as kind of an engine of self-awareness. So I thought that was really interesting. And then another idea that came up is that there's no objective reality because all of reality exists in consciousness, which is inherently subjective.
Yep. Uh-huh.
And that made me think of our conversations about the semantic world and the real world.
Yep.
And I had been thinking about those as the semantic world is a filter that prevents us from experiencing the real world, which I had been labeling as a more or less objectively existing thing or existent thing.
Right.
And I can see it the other way. And I'm just wondering maybe about the relative merits of attaching to one of those models or the other. So those are kind of the two things, responsibility and objective reality.
Right. Well, if we take the first one first, what we're really talking about here is the philosophical field known as epistemology. And if I was going to explain epistemology, simply, it would be how do we know what we know? And how do we know that we know it correctly, if you will? Uh, the Greek roots from the Greek are epi, which is on, like epidermis, right? And steme. And steme means basically to stand on or to stand. So the idea of epistemology, it comes from episteme, something that we can stand on. It's like a solid thing. How do we know that our knowing is solid? I guess you could say, right? And boy, everybody has checked in on this one. The one of the things that I would recommend, see, not Buddhism. People want to say, well, Buddhism says this and Buddhism says that. This is one of those things where the different flavors of Buddhism check in differently. And there is a book that was written from lectures that the Dalai Lama gave at Harvard, where he sorts these out. And he does it so well, I won't even try. But I'll tell you that, one of the sects they call the pure mind sect, right? They think it's all mind. And then there's the in-betweens. Well, there's some objective reality and there's some, but I wouldn't do it justice. So folks that are interested in that from Buddhism, definitely check out, we'll put it in the show notes, this book by the Dalai Lama at Harvard, where he shows that he knows Buddhism. I don't know. And I would say there's probably over 20 major distinct, schools. Uh, so so that question, and the thing about epistemology, or the fundamental mystery, or there is, let's say, a fundamental mystery at the core of the problem of epistemology, and that we've poked at before, which is the I, the witness, the one doing the
The
the whole
standing.
job here. Yeah. And so once again, we're into the mystery. And the Greeks had an interesting word called nous, as the one that knows, the knowing function. And when we spoke before of the Buddha referring to a turning around in the deep seat of consciousness, that's kind of a pointing at that nous's capacity to focus in different ways. So in reference to Faggin's idea of responsibility, I think I've spoken before of the idea of bringing your whole self to something. That, like in fighting, you have to bring your whole self to something, right?
I don't know if we've talked about that on the podcast. Do you wanna say more about it?
Uh, well, for now, I guess we would connect it to this idea of right view that we spoke about last episode in Buddhism. The idea of wanting to experience exactly what is, no more, no less, in the exact proportion that it is, no more, no less. And so the question becomes, well, what gets in the way? And what gets in the way is various dimensions of our small particular, as in the joke of the general at the expense of the particular self.
Or in other words, ego.
Yeah, ego, attachment, attraction, aversion, bewilderment, right?
Right.
All of these things that come to mediate between us and the pure experience of isness in the thing. And as I've said before, that thinking mind, those intermediary steps where people like, oh, we don't even experience reality directly, is the slander, right? It's like, well, now wait a minute, don't be hasty. These are tools to help us experience reality. You know, Kant, for example, refers to time and space as a priori intuitions. So there's an idea that these come onboarded already. They're a priori, which is to say in Latin, they come before. They're prior, a priori, right? So they are tools that help us work in this reality. Because again, as my Zen master said, the world of God is beautiful, but there are no bathrooms and no restaurants. And this is where we get into this a dualistic philosophy. Like I was listening to a guy this morning, and he was explaining what his vision of fascism was, and he brought it all the way down to dualistic philosophy and people taking that to the point where they think that nothing's real. And so if nothing's real, then there's no morality and there's no authority and there's no other humans and there's no cooperation. And I used to have a little cartoon of a guy going, I had escaped, but into an unreality or something like that, into a void, a boundless unreality. And I mean, this is this is a guy who needs a Zen master stick. Pow! Here we are, back to here and now. Okay, there's the reality. But the question is in how we experience it, and how you experience it is a perceptual reality, right? And then what you do to it once it's into that perceptual realm, how you chop it up, how you take your linguistic and your cultural templates and buzzsaws and filters and emulsifiers and all those things, and then if you feed yourself that final product. Well, this Zen idea, and this is where martial arts is so, and it isn't just martial arts, but martial arts is so visceral, it's so reptile brain here and now that, yes, we are a creature that extends in these two places. And I don't believe that dualistic philosophy is the problem that causes fascism. Okay.
Can you explain dualistic philosophy, what you mean by that?
Yeah. Well, dualistic philosophy happens in both Eastern and Western philosophy. And we spoke about it before. I used my special visual aid, the teacup.
Oh, yeah.
So for Platonic dualistic philosophy, there is a realm, and we've referred to the Republic by Plato before, and I think it's in the Republic where he has this idea of the divided line. Okay, but it's not just Plato, right? If we go to Hermetic philosophy, right? Hermes tres megistus, thrice great. Hermes, the father of magic. He says, as above, so below. Well, that means there's an above and there's a below. This is in a fundamental aspect of many religious visions, world visions, not revelations, but this idea that there is a higher world, or in the Chinese Taoist model, they say that there is the pre-birth world, the Xiantian element, earlier heaven, as in before manifestation, and then there's the Hotian, later heaven, after post-birth. It gets translated as pre-birth and post-birth.
Yeah, I guess you see that in Genesis too, and you see that in Taoism with yin and yang kind of emerging from the Tao, right,
Right,
or
right.
the void. So what? Why are you calling out dualistic philosophy? It sounds like everything has that addresses
Oh, I wasn't.
dualism.
I think what dualistic philosophy is it's the multi-model method to me. It says dualistic philosophy comes from the natural human experience of looking at the world and going WTF, right? Like, and why would you do that? Why wouldn't you just like go, you know, kill a pterodactyl and get on with things? Why all this pondering of stuff? That in itself is an important question. But obviously, we have a capacity to do that. And the impulse is to say that I don't understand. I don't understand why I'm here. You remember me referencing just the weirdness of life? I don't understand why people suffer. I don't understand why we die. I don't understand why sometimes I'm sad and sometimes I'm happy. Like, WTF, And so we naturally come to say that we look at the landscape around us, the Taoist 10,000 things, and we don't see an easy and obvious explanation. And so we say, we start to move into other explanations. Well, there's something that likes us because sometimes it's good to us, and then some must be sometimes it doesn't like us because other times it's not very good to us. Floods and volcanoes and you know. So it's not a huge leap to say, well, there's something out there maybe that's determining the stuff that we can't determine. And as soon as you start to posit a part that you can't see, that gives an explanation to all the stuff that you do see and experience, you're kind of in that dualistic experience. And because we have that language and capacity, we can start to build things out of it. We can actually explain some stuff. And we've done pretty good at explaining some stuff, over some thousands of years. But the big nuts we haven't cracked, right? We've been working around the edges, and we've been working maybe with only part of the tools, and maybe part of the things that's happening now is that some of these other tools are coming online, just like other scientific tools are coming online.
So, just to help me understand what you were what the point was you were making about dualistic philosophy, because what I thought I
Okay,
heard
okay.
is that all the threads of philosophy are inherently dualistic, and now I think I'm hearing that there's a worldview emerging, that is not dualistic. Did I understand that correctly?
Well, what I was referring to was this thing that I'd seen where a guy was trying to blame fascism on dualistic philosophy. And
Uh-huh.
I was just saying that dualistic philosophy is the root of everything. So it seems
Okay.
kind of a, a silly argument to make. But of course, there is that danger of escaping into an unreality. Right. That I was talking about. And that's what he was referencing and just trying to make that the fault of everything. I
Got
don't
it.
I don't think I think that's a really low resolution model.
Okay.
And that's all I was saying. But this idea of the dualistic philosophy is part of the quest of the knowing self to unravel the mysteries of the universe. And so that was kind of like to that first part of the question. Um, the And this is a regular recurring mystery, this idea of nous or the knowing, and how do we know the epistemological problem. This is the meditation that brought Descartes to this idea that I am, therefore I think, therefore I am. It was this epistemological question: how do I trust anything? How do I trust my senses? It's like, well, but at some point, you're trying to pick yourself up by your own bootstraps, right? And you have to, at some point, you have to trust something. What do I trust? That was his question. What do I
Mhm.
trust? What's solid enough that I can stand on? You know, like when Thoreau, my favorite line in Walden, where he says, "I want to work my feet down through the mud and slush of opinion and prejudice," and he's talking about I want to work my way through that cultural, linguistic, semantic filtering, chopping, emulsifying, reconfiguring element down to what he calls rocks in place, where I can touch my feet and say, "This is, and no mistake." That's the epistemological quest, right?
And it implies that Thoreau at least believed that beyond all of the semantic filters, there is an objective reality, those stones that he could finally stand on. And I
Yes.
guess, we can never know, unless we know that we have removed all of the semantic filters, essentially lost the ego altogether and are experiencing pure experience. And then we can know if it's objective or not.
And the question is, reduces to how do I know the knower, right? How do I know the experience of knowing to trust that, right? And it once again, who am I? Yeah, we've come reduced down to that same fundamental question.
Mhm.
Uh, and then you go into the Bible, and what does God say? I am that I am. It's like just a statement of identity as the rock's in place that I can say this is and no mistake,
Mhm.
right? And that's basically you can't go past that, right? Except we know that we got here somehow. We know that whatever that whether it's a simulation or it's not a simulation, we know we're going through something. And so the question is how much do we let ride in along with that? I guess we let time and space ride in along with that because it seems to be wired in. I guess we let the fact that I get cold and hungry and sometimes I need to pee, I guess that's we've got to accept the reality of that because we know that right away things don't unfold correctly if we don't, right? So the question is we start our way on that slippery slope and the next thing you know we're part of our culture and we're thinking all kinds of silly things maybe from an objective reality standpoint if there ever is such a thing. All we know is that we compare it to other times and other humans going through the same experience and we go, wow, there's quite a spectrum of the way this can come out.
And quite a degree of, shared experience too.
Right. And so can it all be hallucination? It's a pretty amazing kind of simulation hallucination if it is, because whatever the mystery of I is, or whatever the mystery of you is, there's this overlap.
Yeah, and I don't think the alternative is that it's hallucination per se. I think maybe what he was getting at is that we can never remove enough of the subjective material or the semantic filters to have an objective experience, and nobody is having an objective experience. I think that's as far as that argument went, I think.
And I think that at some point we find that subjective objective thing two sides of a Mobius strip.
Say more.
Well, when Lao Tzu says that there's some reference where he talks about the Tao and he talks about the duh, the 10,000 things, the Tao in manifestation. He says, while we give these things different names, they're the same. And they're just two sides of the coin. They're the yin and the yang, the obvious and the hidden.
Yeah,
And
maybe let's talk more then about how Eastern philosophy comes at this, because I know there's a Buddhist saying that life is like an illusion. Do I have that right?
well, there's 25 different pictures of the
Uh-huh.
degrees and the dimensions of what's illusory and what's not illusory.
But I always like that phrase "like an illusion" because it's kind of easy to get to the end game of this is all a hallucination, and in that context, you can go full hedonistic or you can go full, espousing morality.
Sure,
Um, but like an illusion implies that, there's something else going on, that there's an alternative path, and
sure.
that if we get past the experience of this being an illusion, there's a very stark reality. Um,
Yeah, yep.
yeah.
Did you ever read The Nine Princes in Amber by Roger
No,
Zelazny? Okay,
no.
great, great. It's like a drug, right?
I like Zelazny. I'll check it out.
Zelazny's wonderful, wonderful, and a shout out to a fellow Santa Fean,
Oh, okay.
Roger. He left us too soon, and, I was very honored to get a chance to meet him on one occasion. He actually practiced Shingi, and he came to a workshop that we had at our school,
Oh, cool.
and yeah, and, it was hard for me to not walk around on my knees
Yeah.
because I think so much of him. And for science fiction fans, you gotta check out A Rose for Ecclesiastes by Roger Zelazny. But anyway, in the Chronicles of Amber, the first book of which is Nine Princes in Amber, there's this idea that amber is the one true world. And then there are multiple worlds that he calls shadow, or the Shadowlands. And within the story, our world is one of those shadow worlds. The thing that makes the Princes of Amber special is that they come from Amber, the true world that throws off all the shadow worlds, shadows of Amber, right? And so they have the siddhi, if you will, the magic ability to walk through shadow. So they can come through our world. They can, yeah, and then there's other, I mean, fascinating things. Just great. There's like many of them, so they go on for a while, right? But that's kind of the idea. I think that where I sit in the middle of all these things, um, we can say that it's all mind. But if it's all mind, it's the mind of the Tao, the mind of God, the mind of the creative powers of the universe that's bigger than my mind, for sure. But this idea that there is a level of mind that my mind can participate in its own small, humble way, which, the Buddhist model would say is Buddhahood. Uh, uh, it says that there is this reality that's objective because I'm trying to have a right view of it. Whether it's ultimately, like in the mind of God, all mind, for my purposes, because I need bathrooms and restaurants,
Mhm.
I kind of have to you have to view things from my position. If I sit in my position and I try to say, it's all just an illusion, nothing matters, and everything's relative, um, that's gonna last until lunchtime. And then you're gonna find that actually the difference between having lunch and not having lunch is relevant to you. And even though it's relative because it's you and it's your lunch, it's still relevant to your experience as a human. If you're seriously trying to answer WTF in your own case, as in who am I, then you have to take some things as provisional at least, like time and space and hunger and having a body. And the body is your medium of perception, which is why we said you should come to terms with it, right? And and I think that this is also because you remember this idea, this distinction between theory and practice. Uh, Most of this is theory that's trying to build up an explanation for appearances. But when we start looking into the traditions where there's practice and we look at what results people get from things and then what they're doing and what they're saying and how those things that they're saying compare to the things that other people said who've done those same things, now we've got a kind of almost a scientific process. We're not just saying think this, believe this, we're saying do this, and then this will happen. And
You're
then,
talking about a spiritual practice. So
yeah,
if you do a good job meditating or doing yoga or what have you, there are some results that are more or less predictable.
seems to be.
Yeah.
Yeah. And those people seem to have a better grasp of WTF than those that haven't gone through that process. And usually, I would argue, demonstrably so. And this is the idea of the Zen archer who, when Eugene Herrigel asks him at some point, he brings him into the archery hall at night with the lights out and plants an arrow in the bullseye and then splits the arrow. So he's gone through a process. His experience of things makes a different kind of sense now to him than it does to us uninitiated by that process. And so What my thing has been to just try to collect all this and learn about as much of it from as many different traditions to try to see if there's commonalities in the maps. Do they both have an ocean in the same place? Do they both have mountains in the same place? Maybe this mountain's looking from the north and this one's from the south, but is it the same mountain? Possibly, and that's where modern psychology shows certain things about our physiology and our consciousness, and ancient traditions seem to point in certain things. And, I think we can learn a lot.
Yeah, I mean, there definitely seems to be a consistency about there are ways in which we delude ourselves. There are mechanisms by which to reveal those delusions and therefore see things more clearly, right? And that seeing things more clearly has a commonality across what folks are seeing.
Yeah, and a connection that somehow is our truer self in that higher condition. That's kind of why Plato described himself as a midwife. And uh yeah, I mean there is this idea that we have somewhere to go, that there's a journey to be made. And uh in the shamanic traditions there are often guides to do that. And but I think that in the traditions of the human experience and the search for wisdom, I think there are guides in that also.
So maybe let's come back to the question of responsibility and how kind of taking responsibility, even in things like minor interpersonal conflicts, opens the gates to self awareness, i.e., higher levels of consciousness. Do you have any thoughts about that?
The way that I think about it, uh, here's a good analogy. Uh, when I first began as a porguero, right? Uh, I remember being told that uh, if you put something in your mouth that has a very strong uh, taste that maybe is not pleasant, how you actually can. I mean, if you watch yourself do this, you can see yourself kind of retreat out of the nervous system of the taste mechanism to taste it as little as possible. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I can remember being instructed at one point that you should never say anything about the taste. You should never try to have any kind of reactions because this is a medicine that's there for you. And even when I take uh, uh, we spoke before of the generic concept of eating bitter, right? There is this tendency to pull away, right? Well, now we have that mechanism not just along the taste circuits, okay? We have that through that knowing nous capacity also. There are some things we retract, we don't wanna think about it, right? Sometimes they wake us up at night, and we can't not think about it, right? But we know that there is that impulse to retract ourselves from the experience, pull ourselves out. So part of what when I say bringing yourself to something, I kind of mean bringing all of you through whatever that resistance is that sits between you and the thing that we're talking about, and not recoiling, not letting your small why you likes, dislikes, attractions, aversions, bewilderments sit in between you and that experience. And that often just bringing yourself to it in that way transforms it somehow. I think I talked about working on plumbing in the street and found that if I really brought myself to it, which part of that was first doing the first thing, second doing the second thing, third doing the third, which is also the discipline of when you're doing the first thing, just paying attention to the first thing and not letting the thoughts about the complications that might happen at the fourth and the fifth thing, that will come in its time. Now I'm on the first thing, right? So So there's something about bringing yourself to that that will often sort of dissolve the Gordian knot of the negativity that you foresaw that was shadowing its way from the future back on you, if that makes sense. So that's part of bringing yourself to it. And I think that's probably, they asked a lady, I heard that they asked the lady that had the highest recorded IQ, what makes people stupid? What a great question. Right. And she said what she thought makes people stupid, herself included, is when you let the thought, I'm not getting it, take root. And then you follow that thought thread. And I've experienced this in myself. And there is a counter reaction that you can train in your head to just not let that thought close the apertures. You absorb patterns, you learn things in ways you don't even know you're learning it. So leave the apertures open. Don't indulge the thought that you're not getting it. You are getting it. You just don't know all of the ways you're getting it. So give it time to coalesce, but keep the doors and windows open. Don't close down. Don't contract. And I'm not getting it. You'll get stupider. Okay. I mean, that's a thing. It really is a
It is.
thing.
Yeah.
And that's another form of pulling yourself out of the experience. And why are you pulling it out? Because you're having some thought in that semantic world about the experience and you're letting that pull you out of the experience. And now that's the path that your experience goes on, right? But it didn't have to. And there seems to be some indication that once you get the hang of this, you'll get that. Like, and that will be an easier mechanism. And we talked before about how you can even get hypnotized into this by teachers. Like I had my teacher said, whatever you're going to do, you're always going to have success. Or we talked about the kids who were given a phony test and told they did real well. And then they came back a year later and they tested 9 points higher in their IQ test. Right. Well, something about them told them, well, I'm smart. So I'm going to get it. And then maybe they kept those windows and those doors open to absorb enough to get bigger patterns. And then they did get it, sure enough. And maybe it was just that closing down, that pulling ourselves out of it that kept us from getting it. So that's a good part of what I mean by bringing yourself into it. And it's part of getting some of those things out of the way that maybe we start to pay attention to instead of getting it. So,
Yeah, it reminds me of a few things. One is doing math homework with my kids when they were small, and we'd get a problem right, and then we'd be on to the next one, and they would freeze up. And
yep,
I
yep,
would get frustrated because they're not keeping the apertures open. And the more I got frustrated, the more those apertures closed.
yep.
And we were just joking about it last night over dinner and what a formative experience that was for them.
And math is great for that. There's actually a book out there called Mathematics Made Difficult. And it talks all about that negative loop that people in America with American education seem to get into with math.
Uh-huh.
I don't think that's a universal math experience, though.
Yeah. Well, I think there's kind of a semantic parallel here. I mean semantic in language related between how Fagin is using responsibility and how you're using presence. I think that I think it's David Hawkins who would say that any growth increment requires a measure of courage. That courage is the difference between not getting it and getting it in the most generic or pluralistic sense.
I could make sense out of that explanation, sure.
Yeah. And so you're talking about having a degree of courage in terms of having the experience. And I think Fagin is talking about courage in the sense of looking inside internally to make sure one is taking responsibility for real, right? And I think
Mhm.
those are parallel.
Yeah, I think so. I think
Yeah.
so. When you look at the ways that you might be not taking responsibility, those will be ways you're not bringing yourself
Right.
to it. Yeah. Yeah.
No. Well, if that is more or less addressed, at least for now, then I don't know if this is will spawn further discussion or not. But another curious thing in the podcast with Fagin was talking about free will and how his take, if I got it right, I only listened once, was that free will essentially doesn't exist at the ego level and it fully exists at the post ego level. So, meaning that when we operate out of our true self or as an agent of consciousness, my words, not his,
Uh-huh.
it's all free will and we're actually creating reality.
And Crowley's true will, capital
Yeah.
T, capital W.
So yeah, it made me curious what Sam Harris would say about that, because that was a useful way of thinking about it. As long as the semantic filters are on, or ego is running the show, I can see that being not free will, right? It's
Sure.
basically all the voices that are not us calling the shots.
Yep.
But the big I, the je suis, might have free will, right? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think it's real close to yin will and yang will
Mhm.
in the conversation we had about that. And with the possible, I mean, I guess just the big distinction is whether you're pulling against the soul wind or sailing with it. Whether you're, indulging that particularity or, and I think that this is there's an it again, it comes down to this idea of brain spheres. That one is looking at particularities and one is looking at wholes. And I think it goes all the way back to in the beginning of integral theory, where they talk about that a unit has agency, but it also has partness to a larger whole.
You're talking about Ken Wilber.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Ken Wilber and his integral
And
theory.
Fagin has a word that seems to mean the same thing as Holon. So it made me think he hadn't read Wilber, um, because he came up with a pretty similar idea.
Right.
S- Strias, something like that.
Right. And so, it could be that one of these wills is more associated with our agency and the other is more informed by our participation identity in the larger whole, our partness. Also, our fittingness, if you look at it from that standpoint.
Can you say more about fittingness?
Well, when we plug into our partness correctly, we fit in the larger whole. And, you could argue that then our holonitude is completely fulfilled. Our agency fulfills that need, that aspect, but it fits within the meaning, the context of our partness. And so, and that we get a brain half that kind of thinks in those two ways sort of makes sense. Uh,
Hmm.
you know,
That's interesting. I'm gonna have to think about that more before I can ask you a question about it.
well, and then the collective unconscious from Jung would be an element, say, of a radio station that we can pick up that can inform our partness because it relates to our relationship with the collective. And then dreams and the interesting difficulty that we have sometimes within dreams for the yang will to assert itself. Have you noticed that? All night long I kept trying to find my car keys. Right? But then there is this thing that can happen, which is actually bizarre and has started to happen to me much more now that I'm older and with this chapter, is waking up in the dream and actually saying, okay, I'm in the dream now. What can I do? I can do all kinds of things, it turns out. I mean, there's some practice involved, I think. But that first part, the first time it happened to me, I was in a dream and I was in my white van and everything seemed like normal reality. And then I looked at the van and it was parked right on the edge of a cliff. I mean, like inches from the edge of a cliff. And I was like, wait a minute, I would never have parked the van there. And I know nobody else did. This must be a dream. And then I had the thought, well, if this is a dream, then you could just jump right off this cliff and fly. But I didn't have the complete cojones there manifested in the dream to try it, you know. But then later on, as it's happened more, I have actually been able to manifest more agency within the dream, which is interesting. And I have to wonder how that connects to agency in life, because in some sense, I've released a degree of agency in the external world. Uh, like I told somebody that I had retired, and that I kind of come to the conclusion that if the world wanted more out of me, it was going to have to come and get it. And that was like a week before you called to do this podcast.
Something, something, cold dead hands. Um, I want to go back, Brian. So for myself to kind of encapsulate what we just talked about, and probably maybe it's useful for some of our listeners too, that the way we think about free will can be seen through the lens of the ego being a cause of no free will, and acting beyond the ego being a place where free will exists. But in
Mhm.
addition, you proposed, and I don't know if this was just a spontaneous idea that arose, that in the way that we are holons, meaning that we exist as single entities and as part of a field of entities, right? Community or civilization or shared consciousness, whatever.
Mhm.
We operate with free will to the extent that we realize our wholeness and our individuality. And that plugs us into an experience of partness where we're connected to others in the field, right? Where we might relate to free will in different ways.
Right. And which is why I suggested that they were two sides of a Mobius strip.
Yeah, yeah. I really like bringing the Holon piece into it. Um, you also said something about when dealing with yang will and yin will, it depends on whether you're riding with the soul wind or against it. And I always have trouble with that because I figure if you're riding against the soul wind, you're redefining the destiny point. And so by definition, sort of riding against the soul wind changes destiny and must therefore be an expression of yin will. So it's not
Yeah.
really riding against the soul wind. There's a paradox there.
I think there is a paradox there. And I'm not sure that it's a solvable paradox, because it comes right down to that: how free is free will? Are we completely a soccer ball to our attractions, aversions, and bewilderments? Or once in a while do we dip a paddle in and try to move the boat against those currents? And so my suspicion is that it's probably a slider here too, and not a discrete yes or no. And that we have weak moments and we have stronger moments, but I think that if we work with the model of that there's somewhere to go, that there is a developability, a perfectibility, that there is a purpose to this all, we can pick up a way to kind of dance with this paradox. And that might be the best way to say it. Because I do think it's just an apparent paradox that's created by the dimensionality of the situation. And that when we first talked about yin will and yang will, I remember the question came up, as to whether you're whether you would want, whether it's in your interest to surrender to that, or whether you would want to try to sail against it. And
Same paradox.
my feeling is that that's not that paradox dissolves in the experience or the clicking in of an understanding of the function of the yin will, that it is an unfolding of your true identity, which brings your partness into full fruition, and that it's actually not a paradox, but that has to unfold through process, and that the shoe is maybe not going to fit for quite a bit of that process till it wears in.
Yeah. I'm realizing also that I have a bias towards when we're talking about being a holon, meaning both having individual agency and being part of something. My bias is to assume that we're losing agency when we join. And I've been thinking a lot about joining lately. That might be a
Yeah.
topic for us soon, but just to
Well,
touch on that.
that's dependence, independence, interdependence
Yeah, yeah.
from a
And
couple episodes.
interdependence, and completely having agency and being an integrated part of something. It's
Right,
that feels paradoxical in a way too.
right. I think that there's maybe an unfulfilled collective karma, and that's the big debate. Uh, that's this idea of the eschaton or the omega point or a higher destiny where things show up differently. Um, you can imagine how differently human life has shown up through the different chapters of history, and how at one stage, and in many places we know still, it's really all about finding food. And the world looks one particular way when it's all about finding food. And a chapter before that, a lot of it was about not being food. Uh, and God knows how many times in our story that was the prevailing theme. Uh, so, so it's kind of maybe hard for us to look upstream. I think we can always look back down the trail because we've kind of we've recapitulated it somehow. But I think it is hard to imagine what the next chapter looks like. Like Ursula Le Guin's famous quote about no, people just took the divine right of kings as a given. They couldn't even imagine a world where, without the divine right of kings. And now, we have no trouble seeing it as a fairly ridiculous idea. And we have living kings and queens to keep rubbing our nose in it if we forget about it.
And we have inalienable rights documented, right, for several hundred years now, which is kind of a
Huge,
huge uh,
huge.
huge move away from the divine rights of kings. Yeah.
That and the doctrine of the universal priesthood, which basically is the religious equivalent of the Declaration of Independence.
And that goes back to Luther, right?
Goes back to the Reformation and Martin Luther.
Yeah.
Yeah. And and that's what I've referenced before, that I think that there is something that's trying to happen through the development of history, and that it involves the expression of the individual to larger and larger degrees. But again, the expression of the individual in a way that fulfills the collective.
It's nested.
It's nested, that the collective can't fulfill the collective destiny without fulfilling the destiny of the pieces, that idea.
Yeah.
And of course, there's always going to be people that say, oh, pshaw, but we're not living in caves anymore. So, you know, there's a good arguments, I guess, on both sides. It comes down to, are you are you pessimist or an optimist, I guess.
Right. Good. Well, maybe let's leave it there for now and pick up some of these threads next time.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay. Thank you, Brian.
We'll see you next time. And check out our website, folks.
That's right. Foolsandsagespodcast.com.
Great.